All right, guys, welcome back. So in this part 4, we are going to continue with the layout of the morning news. So in the previous screencast, we took care of the header and we took care of centering most of the layout within the page using our margin 0 auto trick. And if we flip back over to the code, I can show you that. Let's just split all this up so it's a little easier. We're going to be moving all the CSS out of the header in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. So you can see here where we've centered the container. And now the nice thing about this class is that we could use this class anywhere in the page and always get that same centering. So this is a reusable bit of code that we can use throughout. And depending on how complex your layouts are, sometimes you'll have these nested containers depending on what kind of look you need to achieve. So let's take a look at the morning news and see what else we need to do. So trying not to spend too much time looking at all the details, and it's really hard not to. So if we just look at our clone, we can see what we've done already. So we've got this masthead, we have this header, but what we really need to do is we need to isolate the aside and this main section. So let's concentrate our efforts on that. So if we go back to our code and we scroll down, and we take a look at, just get rid of that, and we take a look at our aside, which starts on line 44 and goes all the way down to 55. So we want this aside to essentially float up next to our content over here. So to achieve that, we need to float both of our content sections. So we have this main section and we have this aside. So let's represent both of these up here in our CSS. So we have main, and we're using a pound sign because that's a ID. And then we also have an aside. So I'm only going to be using the aside here, so we can just call that by its tag. We don't need to use an ID or a class selector there. And what we're going to do is I'm going to float each one of these left and right. So the main we're going to float to the left, and the aside we're going to float to the right. And our total width is 850 pixels. So let's start out with a left width of, let's go 700 pixels. And on the aside, let's go 150 pixels. So let's save that and see what kind of results we get. Okay, we're kind of getting there. I would argue that we probably want to leave a little more space for that. So let's go to let's try 250. See what that looks like. That's pretty close. I'm happy with that. So we'll leave that alone for right now. And in fact, if we want to, we can color this. So you could go background, FF. That's a little obnoxious, but you'll get the idea. And on the main, we'll use, there you go. So now you can start to see how this cloning starts to happen. And we can even extend that further by going in and working on the header and the main section area in this H1. So now that we have our two sections kind of on either sides, we have our layout positioned, we have all of our different sections positioned. Now we can kind of move on to a few more detail things. So first of all, let's get rid of these background colors because they're a little distracting. Okay, and let's just double check our reference. So there's a few things we need to do. I'm not going to worry about everything up here yet. I'm just going to concern myself with the navigation, and I'm not going to deal with the typography in this heading right now. I don't need to worry about that. So all I want to do is make sure that my H1 is actually an H1 for the heading, and it is, and I think it might be worth going in and just making that font a little bit bigger just so it looks good. So let's try like 2.2 M's. Maybe a little bit bigger. You know what, let's go 3. There we go. And also, I'm going to zero out that margin just for good measure. Okay. So this is covered in the text this week, but M's are kind of a relative measurement an M is equal to the point size of the text it's referencing. So if you have a 12-point font, 1M equals 12 points. If you're using a 20-point font, 1M is 20 points. So it's a nice relative size. So the M's will always size off the default browser. So if I am in my browser and I come up here and I want to zoom in, or excuse me, actually, does Chrome zoom in or out? Whoops, let me close that. So some browsers resize text, some actually zoom. Chrome seems to zoom and not just do the text. But anyway, we want to keep that font size relative because we do want to give the end user some control over text resizing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the course as we get into more usability and accessibility and things like that. So we made our font size a little bit bigger for our header, and that's all good. And what we'll want to do quickly here too is just add a navigation. And within our nav tag, we basically just want to put an ordered list, or excuse me, an unordered list in here. And let's just check and see what there are. So we have essays, humor, profiles, culture, galleries, and about. So just put a couple of those in there. Essays. All right. Humor, profiles, about. Okay, so you guys get the idea there. And let's refresh that. Okay, so now we have a link, or excuse me, now we have a navigation. These do technically need to be links. So let's just make one of them a link so you can see. So this is basic link text. I'm not going to spend too much time going over this. You guys should already have the link text down. But it's basically the A tag. The href is the final path of that particular navigation. So that could be an HTML folder, a file, a path, a directory, whatever. And we surround our text in the A tag. And you'll see that we now have that as a link. So the problem with this navigation now is that they have this nice horizontal layout with these nice hovers, and we just kind of have this ugly list. So we want to get rid of that ugly list and turn it into something that looks a little more like the navigation that you see up here. So first of all, let's get rid of these bullets. So we're going to be working on the nav and all of its children. So what we can do is we can come down here and we can go nav ul. So this will only affect the unordered lists inside of a navigation tag. So this is the parent, this is the child. We're only going to be applying these styles to the child with this selector. So what we can do is the first thing we need to do is get rid of these bullets. And that is controlled by the list style type property. And if we pass that a none, you can see that our bullets have gone away. Now the other thing I know you need to do with ULs is always zero out the margin, padding, and that will always get your ULs and LIs to stick back over to the right. Most browsers apply a margin and a padding to unordered lists, so you need to always remember to zero those out. I'm gonna show you guys a reset style sheet, which is talked about in the book. I'll show you that in the next screencast when we move all the CSS out. But for now, just go ahead and zero that margin and padding out in your UL. Just remember that you'll sometimes have to do that. So the next thing we have to do is we need to get all these little list items, all these LIs, we need to get them into a horizontal pattern. We don't want them stacked one on top of each other. We want them next to one another. So what we essentially want to do here is float each of the individual LIs to the left. And if we give them a specific width, they will pop nicely in next to one another. So let me show you what that looks like. So if we come up here to our CSS and we add a selector for this list item. So now we're getting even more specific with the selector. We're saying I only want to affect the LIs in the unordered lists in the nav tag. And what we want to do is we want to float these to the left, just like we did with our main content sections. And then we want to give them a width. Actually, yeah, let's give them a width for now and see what that looks like. Okay, so that works pretty well. The only problem is that because we're floating all these LIs, it's not clearing this content below it. So what's happening is this block content is kind of getting sucked up next to our floats. So let me show you what that looks like. And it's kind of hard to see, but basically the UL is forming a block down here, but the LIs are floating, so it's causing kind of a screen error, basically. So we can mitigate that a few different ways. We can mitigate that first by floating the links and not the LI. So you'll see right there that now we're floating the A tags and not the LI tags. So the UL block still stays intact. We don't have to worry about that messing with the rest of the design. But the problem is 100 pixels a little too wide. So let's try, actually let's not put any width on there. Instead, let's just do a padding. And let's do a 2 pixel top and 5 pixel left and right. Let's see what that gets us. All right, that's still not quite what I'm looking for. Oh, I figured it out. So we only had one A tag here. So we need to go through and make all of those A's. And okay, so you'll notice both ways we're still getting this, our content still isn't clearing. So you can actually do this either way. I think I'm going to stick with my original method and do it that way. Let's look and see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so let's add a couple more just so we're at the right length here. And I think that we're going to want to go a little shorter. Okay, they're right up on one another right now, and that's fine. So let's leave them like that for right now. And I know that doesn't quite look right, but I'm going to show you what we're going to do after that. But one thing I do want to show you is the clear. And this section right here is getting sucked up next to our float because it hasn't been cleared of that float. So what we need to do is we need to come in here and add a selector for content. And we need to say clear both. Boom. And there you can see that now our paragraph is cleared underneath the navigation. And in fact, what we can do is add a little bit of bottom margin to that to push things down. Let's see, didn't want to do that. In fact, let's go ahead and go one more up to the nav. So the reason that didn't work is because the UL element is not being floated, just the elements within it. So the UL is actually this tiny little sliver up here. So let me show you that. All right, so this UL will float up above the LIs because of the way they're positioned right now. So we need to set just a height on the nav. Let's just say 50 pixels for right now. And that will push everything down. So that's a little bit better. Okay, so we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. One last thing before we move on here is I want to go ahead and set a specific padding on our links so that they're a little more spread apart. And we can just do that by giving it a top and bottom and a left and a right padding. And that looks a little bit better. So let's go back up to this nav, make that height a little smaller, and we can do just a small top margin to make that a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so the last thing on these links is this hover, and that's actually pretty easy. We can just use the pseudo class hover on that A, and we can give it a background of just a dark color and make the color of the text white. So there's that effect right there. So we're starting to get closer. It's definitely looking more like the morning news, and we're kind of taking baby steps towards getting this layout proper. So in the next set of lessons, we're going to kind of flesh this out a little bit more. We're going to start tweaking the typography. We're going to start building more blocks, and we're also going to start getting into more of this content detail and sidebar detail. But for the most part, you could build out the rest of the content of this site, and you're most of the way there in terms of where your layout's at. So we're going to continue on with this project in the coming screencasts, and we'll see how close we can get this site.